Well, folks, I know a lot of us are feeling anxious about the election results, especially what a second Trump term could mean for LGBTQ plus rights.
Definitely a lot of uncertainty right now.
So today we're going to dive into that head first. We're looking at this Time magazine article, what Trump's win means for LGBTQ plus rights.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one.
It came out November 9th, so literally right after the election, 2024, and it's pretty intense. I mean, the article doesn't mess around. It connects the dots between like Trump's campaign rhetoric, that Agenda 47 platform of his, and some serious legal analysis. Paints a kind of clear picture, unfortunately.
Yeah, it really does lay it all out there. Not much sugarcoating.
Okay, so let's break it down. Right off the bat, the article highlights Trump's anti-trans rhetoric during the campaign. Remember that ad? The one criticizing Kamala Harris for supporting, they, them pronouns.
Yeah, that was a pretty strong statement, right?
Totally. And the article, it points out that according to ad impact data, Republicans spent, get this, almost $215 million on anti-trans ads during the election.
Wow, $215 million. That's not chump change.
No, that's a serious investment. So it seems like this wasn't just about grabbing votes. It was about setting the stage for some real policy changes.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's all right there in Agenda 47. They're not even trying to hide it. Banning trans people from the military, cutting funds for schools that teach, quote unquote, radical gender ideology. It's all spelled out.
Yikes. Okay, so we've got the rhetoric, the platform, but how does this actually play out, like legally? How do these things actually become, real world changes?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And this is where it gets interesting. The article brings in this legal expert, Katie Iyer, professor at Rutgers Law School, and she says the real game changer here, the thing to watch, is Trump's potential court appointments.
The Supreme Court, right? Everyone's been buzzing about that.
Exactly. You get a more conservative judiciary, and suddenly the whole interpretation of LGBTQ plus rights cases could flip.
We've seen some appeals courts ruling in favor of, trans individuals lately.
All right, exactly. But with a different Supreme Court, that trend could easily reverse itself. It's scary to think about.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. The article highlights 3 big areas where we could see major impacts. First one, the transgender military ban. That was a huge deal during Trump's first term. Can you, remind everyone what went down?
Okay, so back in 2017, Trump reversed that Obama-era policy that allowed trans people to serve openly in the military. He said it was about the cost of gender-affirming surgeries, but,
Come on, that was just a cover.
pretty much. And of course, it sparked massive controversy, tons of lawsuits, the whole 9 yards.
And then Biden overturned it, thank goodness, when he came in.
Yep. But, the experts quoted in this Time article, they think Trump will likely reinstate the ban basically as soon as he's back in office.
So round 2 of those legal battles.
Probably. Yeah, strap in, folks. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Okay, so military ban check. What's the next area where Trump's policies could really hit hard?
Healthcare restrictions. And this is where things get especially worrisome, particularly for trans youth.
Yeah, there's been this whole wave of state-level bans on gender-affirming care for trans minors. It's honestly terrifying how many people are already affected by that.
It's really snowballing. As of August 2024, the Human Rights Campaign reported 26 states have either passed bans or are actively working on policies to restrict this kind of care. Think about it, that's 39% of transgender youth living in states where their health care is under threat.
And where does Trump stand on this?
Oh, he's been super vocal. Wants a nationwide ban on gender-affirming care for minors. One way he could pull that off is by denying federal funding to hospitals that provide that care.
That's just, wow. What are legal experts saying about that? Could he actually do that?
The article quotes the ACLU. They've been fighting these state-level bans in court. They're ready to challenge any federal restrictions too, but, it's an uphill battle, especially with, the potential changes to the Supreme Court and everything.
This is starting to feel a lot like what happened with abortion access.
Yeah.
Like a patchwork of different laws across the country.
Yeah.
Some states protecting rights, others actively trying to take them away.
Right, that's exactly the comparison they make in the article. They talked to Tara McKay. She's the co-founder and director of the Vanderbilt LGBTQ plus policy lab. And she's like, yeah, a federal ban could actually lead to even more state-level action. Your rights, depending on your zip code.
So on top of potential legal battles, we've got this whole fragmented landscape to worry about. What a mess. Anything else on the healthcare front?
Well, there's this big Supreme Court case coming up, United States v. Scarametti. It's about Tennessee's ban on gender transition care for minors. could set a major precedent, not just for healthcare, but for like broader civil rights issues.
So much writing on that. Okay,
Yeah.
we've got this legal battle brewing, potential patchwork of state laws,
Mhm.
a landmark Supreme Court case on the horizon. It's a lot. But beyond all the legal and political stuff, you know, what about the actual human impact? The article talks about mental health concerns, right?
Yeah, and this is where McKay's research is really important. Her lab found that like exposure to negative news and media coverage on LGBTQ plus issues can actually increase suicidal ideation among LGBTQ plus youth.
That's just, oh man. And with all this uncertainty around a second Trump term, I can only imagine that anxiety, that fear is going to get even worse.
For sure. And get this, the article mentions this crazy statistic from the Trevor Project, their crisis hotline. They saw a 700% increase in calls after Trump's victory was
The
announced.
700%.
Yeah.
Seriously.
It really hits home, you know. These aren't just abstract policy debates. This is real life. This is
Yeah.
people's lives. Kids who are scared, who are being told they're not allowed to just be who they are.
It's heartbreaking. So, okay, we've covered a lot. Potential for a reinstated military ban, escalating healthcare restrictions, legal battles galore. But there's one more big area the article explores that we haven't gotten to yet. Title IX, education, and like how trans people identify themselves.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Trump seems to be going after the very definition of sex, trying to make it really narrow. Could have huge consequences for trans folks.
All right, well, we've definitely covered enough ground for now. Let's take a break and come back to that in part 2.
Okay, so ready to dive back in. We were about to unpack this whole thing about Trump's policies, how they could impact Title IX, education, even like how transgender people identify themselves. This is where the Time article gets kind of complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot. And it all seems to stem from this whole focus on, transgender women in sports, right? Remember how much Trump hammered on that during the campaign? Keep men out of women's sports over and over. Felt like a dog whistle,
Oh, yeah, totally. And it's all tied into this bigger push to redefine sex, make it super narrow, like purely biological, basically trying to exclude transgender people from any kind of legal protection. The article explains how Trump wants to use Title IX to ban trans women from women's sports.
Just to be clear for everyone listening, can you remind us, what is Title IX exactly?
Sure. So Title IX is this federal civil rights law, right? And it basically says you can't discriminate based on sex in any educational program or activity that gets federal funding. So that's schools, colleges, universities, anything getting money from the government.
So in theory, Title IX should actually be protecting trans students, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Trump has said he wants Congress to interpret Title IX in a way that specifically excludes trans women from competing in women's sports. And here's the thing. He could actually also roll back those Biden-era expansions to Title IX that, protect trans students more broadly. And he could do that without even needing Congress to sign off on it. He could just, reinterpret the law through his administration's policies.
Whoa, seriously. That's a lot of power. So what are the legal experts saying about all this?
Well, they interviewed Simone Chris for this article. She's a civil rights attorney, director of the Transgender Rights Initiative at Southern Legal Counsel, and she's pretty worried about this whole push to redefine sex.
Why is that?
Well, she sees it as part of this strategy, right, to exclude trans people from all aspects of public life, not just sports, healthcare, housing, jobs. It could impact everything.
Yeah, and the article mentions that example from Florida, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a scary one. So Florida basically made it impossible for people to change the gender marker on their driver's licenses. Imagine if that happened for federal documents,
Yeah.
passports and stuff.
That would be a nightmare. It would make it so hard for trans people to travel, to work, to even open a bank account, just to function.
Exactly. And Chris makes this point that having accurate ID, it's not just about convenience, it's about dignity, It's about being recognized for who you are.
It feels like we're going backwards.
Yeah.
We made so much progress on LGBTQ plus rights. It's hard to believe we're even having these conversations in 2024.
Yeah, it's definitely a step in the wrong direction. And I think when you zoom out, what we're seeing is a potential rollback of decades of progress. It's almost like they're trying to erase trans people.
It's honestly terrifying. So where do we go from here? What can we even do?
Well, the Time article, it ends on kind of a somber note, but there's a glimmer of hope, I guess. They emphasize that there are going to be legal battles, probably tons of them, challenging the healthcare restrictions, trying to stop the trans military ban, fighting over the interpretation of Title IX.
Sounds like a long fight ahead.
Yeah, it won't be easy. But they also talk about the importance of, advocacy, allyship. They quote Amara Jones. She asks this really powerful question. How are people going to stand up for LGBTQ plus rights during Trump's second term? Like, what does allyship even look like in this new reality?
That's a really good question. What can we do in our communities, at work, with our families to make things better, to be more supportive?
Exactly. We can't just sit back and let this happen. We have to stay informed, stay engaged, and be ready to fight back.
This has been pretty intense. I think we need to acknowledge, this is heavy stuff, Yeah. The potential consequences of these policies are real, and they're really scary.
Yeah, absolutely. This isn't like an academic discussion. This is people's lives we're talking about, their well-being, their basic rights.
Okay, so before we wrap up part 2, let's recap what we learned from the Time article. We talked about the potential rollback of all the progress we made on LGBTQ plus rights, the very real possibility of legal battles on a bunch of different fronts, and those serious concerns about healthcare access, education, and even just being able to have accurate identification as a trans person. Oh, we talked about the mental health impact of all of this, which is, incredibly worrying.
And most importantly, I think we were reminded that everyone has a role to play in making society more fair, more just for everyone. It's not just on LGBTQ plus folks to fight for their rights. It's on all of us to stand up for what's right.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So for part 3, I want to zoom out a little bit, get some historical context from you. This isn't the first time LGBTQ plus rights have been under attack, right? Understanding the patterns of the past can help us navigate the present and maybe even create a better future.
Absolutely. There's a lot we can learn from how activists have navigated these kinds of backlashes before, and trust me, there have been a lot.
Well, I'm really interested to hear your take on that. I think our listeners are too. Let's dive into that in part 3. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dives into LGBTQ plus rights and Trump's second term. You were going to give us some historical context. Sometimes I feel like, looking back can help us understand what we're dealing with now.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, but historical perspective is super important. The fight for LGBTQ plus rights, it's never been a straight line. More 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Advances and then backlashes, like a pendulum or something.
So what are some of those moments from the past that really stand out to you? What echoes what we're seeing now?
Well, one era that jumps out is the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic. I mean, that was it was terrifying for the LGBTQ plus community. So much fear, so much discrimination, and just a total lack of compassion from, those in power.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine the pain, the loss.
It was a dark time for sure. Hate crimes were on the rise and people were literally dying and nobody seemed to care. People were afraid to even get medical help. They were scared of being ostracized, discriminated against.
But even in all that darkness, something powerful happened.
Yeah, exactly. The AIDS crisis, it sparked this whole new wave of activism. LGBTQ plus folks and their allies, they just rose up, demanding recognition, healthcare, an end to the stigma. They were fighting back against just the indifference, the cruelty. Organizations like ACTUP, Gay Men's Health Crisis, they were on the front lines demanding research, treatment, compassion.
It's amazing, that they were able to take such a horrific experience and turn it into something that pushed for change.
It really shows you the resilience of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it reminds us that even when things seem really bleak, you can't give up the fight for justice, for equality. We saw a lot of progress in the years after that, but, and this is important, those victories, they were hard won. And they can be taken away, There are always people who want to turn back the clock, who want to limit the rights of marginalized groups.
So where does Trump's second term fit into all this? How does it connect to those historical patterns?
Well, I think it's part of this larger backlash against social justice movements that we've been seeing for a while now, like a resurgence of conservative ideology trying to reinforce traditional power structures, push back against the gains made by women, by minorities, and by LGBTQ plus people.
And Trump's rhetoric, his policies, they definitely seem to be feeding into that.
Oh, absolutely. That whole emphasis on traditional family values, the attacks on trans rights, trying to restrict access to reproductive health care, it's all part of the same playbook, unfortunately.
So if we look at history, what can we learn? How did LGBTQ plus activists handle these kinds of backlashes in the past?
They organized, they mobilized, they fought back on like every level. They built these powerful coalitions with other social justice movements because they realized their struggles were all interconnected. They challenged laws in court, pushing the legal system to recognize their rights. And maybe most importantly, they educated the public, they shared their stories, they made people understand, they made people care.
So it's not about giving up. It's about like channeling that energy, that anger into action.
Exactly. This is not the time to be passive. We need to learn from the past, build on the progress that's already been made, and just keep fighting. And remember, allyship is key. It's not just on LGBTQ plus people to fight for themselves. It's on all of us to stand up for what's right.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We all have a responsibility to make society more inclusive, more equitable. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's like the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think it's this. Knowledge is power. Stay informed, understand what's at stake, and be ready to fight for equality. That might mean supporting LGBTQ plus organizations, contacting your representatives, educating yourself and others about these issues. Every action, no matter how small, it makes a difference.
I love that. This has been, well, a little bit heavy, but also really inspiring. Thanks for, for sharing your insights, helping us make sense of all this.
It was my pleasure. And to our listeners, I'll leave you with this. What role are you going to play in shaping the future of LGBTQ plus rights? The answer is inside each of us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for what's right.